What began as a one-sided economic ambush from Donald Trump has now evolved into a strategic masterclass from Mark Carney. The tariffs were meant to punish Canada, isolate it, and bring it to the negotiating table on its knees. But Carney had no interest in playing that game. While Trump was tossing around tariffs like grenades in a boardroom, Canada was quietly building something unshakable, a fortress economy. Carney's vision didn't stop at damage control. His doctrine was simple but powerful. Adapt faster than they can escalate.
If you're done watching corrupt elites rig the system and leave you behind, subscribe now. If you want real talk, raw truth, and zero spin, this is your channel. If you're ready to fight back, hit that subscribe button and stand with us.
The government doubled down on support for strategic industries: metals, forestry, pharmaceuticals, and green tech. Special economic zones were established across provinces to attract investment, backed by tax breaks for domestic production and R&D. It wasn't just about replacing lost U.S. demand. It was about redefining what a 21st century Canadian economy could be. And it worked. By the end of the year, domestic pharmaceutical production had increased by 34%. Auto parts manufacturing rebounded thanks to Asian partnerships. And copper exports found new buyers in India and Brazil. The fortress didn't just hold, it expanded. Trump's tariffs backfire hard. Meanwhile, in the United States, the fallout was worse than expected. The tariffs had unintended boomerang effects. American manufacturers who depended on Canadian steel and lumber faced rising costs and project delays. The housing market, already squeezed by inflation and labor shortages, was now choking on soaring lumber prices. The cost of copper-based components in everything from electronics to cars skyrocketed, creating bottlenecks that no executive could fix. Instead of making America more competitive, Trump had made it more expensive. Consumer prices rose, small businesses shuttered, and supply chain disruptions became the new normal. And when Canadian firms exited the U.S. market altogether, American consumers discovered just how deeply integrated the two economies had been. For Trump, the trade war had been a publicity stunt, an economic WWE match where bravado replaced policy. But when the market stopped cheering, all that was left was noise and consequences. The BRICS shift accelerates, and Canada finds its place. One of the most decisive global outcomes of Trump's tariff rampage was the acceleration of dollarization. Countries around the world, particularly those in BRICS, saw America's weaponization of trade as a red flag. If the U.S. could turn on Canada, a close and peaceful ally, what would stop it from punishing anyone who disagreed? So BRICS pushed harder. Cross-border payments began shifting to alternative currencies. Russia and China increased their gold reserves. South Africa began negotiating trade in rands. And while Trump saw this as a betrayal, Carney saw it as a window. Canada didn't run from the shifting global order. It leaned into it. Quietly, Canada began working with BRICS-aligned states on investment agreements, technology licensing, and joint ventures. Canadian LNG contracts were inked with India. Rare earth deals were made with Brazil. AI research centers were co-developed with South Korea. Carney didn't choose sides. He built bridges. And in a divided world, bridge builders become indispensable. Grassroots patriotism becomes economic muscle. One of the most surprising and potent developments during this conflict was a rise of economic patriotism among Canadian citizens. The Buy Canadian movement, born out of frustration with Trump's disrespectful rhetoric, evolved into a national crusade. It wasn't just about boycotting U.S. goods. It was about rediscovering Canadian identity. Consumers consciously started replacing everyday products, from ketchup in cars to medicine and mattresses, with Canadian alternatives. Supermarkets reported a surge in local brand loyalty. Small businesses thrived as public support became financial support. Entire sectors, once teetering under global competition, found new life through patriotic consumerism. Carney didn't invent this movement, but he understood its power. His government boosted it with subsidies for Canadian-made products, marketing campaigns that highlighted homegrown quality, and federal incentives for companies that source locally. In economic terms, it was demand re-engineering. In cultural terms, it was a quiet revolution, and it made Canada more resilient than ever. The fallacy of Trump's deficit doctrine. At the core of Trump's miscalculation was a fundamental misunderstanding of trade economics. He believed trade deficits were a sign of weakness, and that tariffs would fix them. But deficits aren't inherently bad. They reflect consumer demand, economic complexity, and production specialization. The real vulnerability lies not in the deficit itself, but in dependency on imports that cannot be quickly or affordably replaced. So when Trump slapped a 50% tariff on Canadian copper, he imagined leverage. But what he created was scarcity. American tech firms scrambled to find alternate sources. Prices soared. Projects stalled. And Canada? It rerouted its copper to Asia, where demand was booming and prices were higher. In trying to dominate, Trump revealed his own dependency, and Carney, ever the economist, capitalized on every exposed weakness. Carney's long game, a future built on stability. Carney never cared for short-term applause. His legacy would be built on durability. Under his leadership, Canada began laying the groundwork for what he called the three-pillar strategy: economic sovereignty, international trust, and domestic innovation. Economic sovereignty meant investing in internal production of strategic goods, medical supplies, semiconductors, food, and energy. Supply chain vulnerabilities were systematically identified and replaced with domestic capacity or allied imports. International trust involved strengthening relationships through diplomacy and transparency. Canada signed bilateral agreements with smaller nations, not just giants, earning a reputation as a reliable and fair partner. Domestic innovation focused on transitioning to a green, digital economy. Investments flowed into clean energy, AI, robotics, and biotech. Universities and startups became partners in industrial policy, not just observers. While Trump focused on polls and press conferences, Carney focused on plans and permanence. As the conflict dragged on, the diplomatic fallout deepened. The EU, already frustrated with Trump's sporadic tariffs on its steel and automobiles, began negotiating directly with Canada on joint trade protocols. Japan and Canada signed a comprehensive energy partnership. Even Mexico, once tethered to the U.S. in the NAFTA orbit, started deepening trade with Canadian suppliers. America wasn't just losing influence, it was being replaced. Trump's vision of America first had backfired into America alone. And for every door he slammed, Carney opened another. Looking back, Trump's trade war will not be remembered as a show of strength. It will be remembered as a strategic misfire, a moment when ego overtook economics and posturing undermined partnership. Mark Carney didn't just survive the assault. He transformed it into opportunity. He proved that leadership is not about volume or spectacle. It's about clarity, resolve, and trust. And while Trump yelled into cameras, Carney whispered to boardrooms, shook hands in backrooms, and built an economic foundation that couldn't be shaken by tariffs or tantrums. In the story of this economic standoff, Trump was a noise, Carney was a signal, and in the long run, history always sided with the signal. Carney's global chessboard leaves Trump in check. When Donald Trump weaponized tariffs to punish America's closest allies, he assumed a simple rule: economic might makes right. He believed Canada would fold, that it had to fold, that it was too small, too dependent, too polite to push back. But he wasn't going up against polite diplomacy. He was facing Mark Carney. And Carney doesn't play checkers. He plays chess. In the economic equivalent of four-dimensional match, Carney didn't just absorb the hits. He repositioned Canada on the global chessboard, anticipating not just Trump's next move, but the long-term consequences of America's economic aggression. While Trump played to the cameras, Carney played to the bond markets, the CEOs, the trade envoys, the engineers, the port authorities, and the long game. And the world noticed. The rise of Canada's global trade identity. Before the Trump tariffs, Canada was largely seen as a stable but secondary trade player, a polite participant in America's supply chains. But Trump's belligerence shattered that mold. Suddenly, Canada was on the map as an assertive, globally connected, resource-rich nation that refused to be economically bullied. The Canadian global trade identity was born, not out of vanity but necessity. Mark Carney understood that the way to replace a hostile trade relationship wasn't to pick a new master. It was to cultivate a diversified garden. So Canada doubled its outreach efforts to Southeast Asia, signed memorandums of understanding with Gulf states, restructured investment flows with EU partners, and elevated its presence in African emerging markets. Wherever Trump sowed chaos, Carney offered stability. While U.S. officials arrived with threats, Canadian diplomats came with collaboration, and global business took notice. Canadian infrastructure, not just recovery but reinvention. Trump wanted to choke Canada's economy by targeting its exports. Carney flipped that on its head. He made exports stronger, faster, and broader. A sweeping infrastructure revolution began, not with press conferences, but with shovels and blueprints. New LNG terminals were constructed along the Atlantic and Pacific coasts to make Canada a go-to supplier for natural gas in Europe and Asia. Inland rail projects began connecting resource-rich areas like Saskatchewan and Alberta directly to global shipping routes, bypassing traditional bottlenecks and reducing dependency on U.S. transit infrastructure. Carney's government also invested heavily in digital infrastructure, nationwide broadband expansion, advanced port logistics technology, and AI-based trade facilitation tools, making Canadian trade leaner, smarter, and faster. This was about building a next-generation economy that didn't just survive a tariff war. It thrived in its aftermath. Trump's allies turned skeptical. As Trump escalated his tariff campaign, even his own allies began to sweat. Republican governors in states like Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, states deeply intertwined with Canadian auto supply chains, began facing a firestorm of complaints from manufacturers. Executives warned of layoffs, plant closures, and spiraling costs, all thanks to supply chain disruptions caused by Canada-U.S. trade breakdowns. And when Canadian firms began rerouting their investments to Europe and Asia, Trump's own economic team started issuing quiet warnings. The damage was becoming structural, not temporary. But Trump didn't listen. He doubled down. He declared that tariffs would make America rich again. The market shrugged. The dollar stumbled. Canadian steel found new buyers in Germany. American automakers begged for exemptions. And Carney? He just kept building. Carney's energy diplomacy reshapes global supply. Energy became Carney's trump card. Pun intended. While Trump tried to use energy exports as a club, threatening allies with supply freezes if they didn't fall in line, Carney turned Canada's energy sector into a diplomatic olive branch by working with India, South Korea, Japan, and Germany to ensure stable, long-term Canadian LNG and oil exports. He repositioned Canada not as an energy hegemon, but as a reliable partner in a volatile world. In fact, several nations that once depended almost exclusively on American energy began shifting portions of their contract to Canada, citing reliability, environmental standards, and political stability as reasons. Carney's administration backed this shift with a clean energy transition plan that included tax credits for hydrogen production, carbon capture projects, and First Nations-owned renewable energy corridors. While Trump shouted about coal and oil domination, Carney made Canada the go-to nation for responsible energy in a climate-conscious era. Canada's new economic nationalism, a blueprint for the future. Carney didn't just offend Canada economically. He transformed how Canadians see their economy. For decades, economic nationalism had been seen as outdated or regressive, but under Carney, it became aspirational. This wasn't about shutting out the world. It was about making sure Canada was never caught unprepared again. A nation that had once relied heavily on U.S. imports began focusing on self-sufficiency across critical sectors: healthcare, advanced tech, agriculture, and defense manufacturing. This new economic nationalism was smart, not insular. It encouraged innovation, supported local producers, and rebuilt Canadian confidence. Supply chains that had been offshore for decades were brought home. Small businesses became national heroes. Canadians weren't just shopping local. They were investing, voting, and planning local. And it all stemmed from one question Carney had asked during the early days of the trade crisis. What if the next crisis is worse? Trump's polls dropped as U.S. business turns on him. While Canada was surging forward, Trump was beginning to face blowback. By mid-2025, American business lobbies were in open revolt. The National Association of Manufacturers issued a rare rebuke, warning that the president's tariff war had triggered long-term damage to U.S. competitiveness. Auto industry groups, Semiconductor coalitions, and agriculture boards all published damning impact reports linking plant closures, lost contracts, and shrinking export markets to the White House's economic aggression. Trump tried to blame Carney, but the numbers told the truth. The American Chamber of Commerce reported that for the first time in 50 years, Canada had overtaken the U.S. in net positive investment flows from Asia, and Trump's approval ratings among business leaders cratered. Once hailed as a pro-business president, he now found himself isolated, blamed not just for a trade war, but for losing it. Canada's economic leadership on the world stage. As 2026 loomed, Canada stood taller than ever before. Its economy had rebounded faster, its trade relationships were stronger, and its diplomatic reputation was soaring. Mark Carney was now seen not just as a national leader, but as a global statesman. Canada led new trade frameworks that brought smaller economies into regional investment networks. It co-chaired environmental and financial reform forums with Germany and Japan. Its ministers were requested at summits once dominated by the U.S. And back home, Canadians were proud again, not just for surviving, but for leading. In a late 2025 summit, ironically hosted in Washington, Trump attempted to restart trade talks with Canada. Cameras caught the moment when the American president extended a hand and tried to smile. Carney nodded politely, but didn't promise anything. There was no need, because this time, Canada wasn't negotiating from fear or desperation. This time, Canada was negotiating from strength, and the world knew it. The great inversion, when the mouse roared and the elephant blinked. In 2024, when Donald Trump slapped tariffs on Canadian copper, aluminum, steel, and even lumber, his message was crystal clear: fall in line or fall behind. But he gravely misjudged the moment. He assumed Canada would beg for mercy. What he got instead was an economic and diplomatic counteroffensive so sophisticated, so quietly potent, that by mid-2025, Washington insiders were whispering the unthinkable. Canada had outplayed the United States, and not with retaliation, with reinvention. From economic target to trade architect. At first, Canada was a target, but Carney, methodical, visionary, and unshakably calm, transformed that target into a launch pad. Trump threw the first punch, and Carney turned a blow into fuel. Under Carney's leadership, Canada didn't merely resist Trump's tariff campaign. It built an entirely new trade architecture, one that no longer hinged on American whims, one that spanned continents, not just a single border. Carney's administration fast-tracked trade deals with ASEAN members, expanded ties with India through strategic technology exchanges, and open investment forums with Africa's fastest-growing economies. Canadian exports began to flow where U.S. threats could not reach, and in currencies that didn't bear the dollar geopolitical baggage. In just under 2 years, Canada redefined its economic identity, not a junior partner, not an economic extension of the U.S., but a sovereign, strategic trade leader capable of shaping, not just surviving, the new global economy. Trump's boomerang economy, the tariffs that bit back. Back in the U.S., Trump was still shouting about making America great again by slapping tariffs on everything that moved. But the consequences were biting back. American manufacturers, once optimistic about Trump's America First doctrine, found themselves choked by rising costs. Lumber shortages delayed housing construction. Auto parts spiked in price. Consumer electronics, many of which had Canadian components, began disappearing from shelves or doubling in price. And it wasn't just the goods, it was the confidence. Investors began shifting capital to Toronto and Vancouver. Canadian dollar-denominated bonds became more attractive than U.S. Treasuries in certain emerging markets. Global businesses began hedging their risk, not just by diversifying supply chains, but by diversifying away from the United States. Every time Trump doubled down on tariffs, the world found another reason to trust Canada a little more. The lesson from this saga is brutally clear. Bravado cannot replace strategy. Threats cannot substitute for trust. And loudness is not leadership. Mark Carney taught the world that diplomacy can be quiet, trade can be smart, and sovereignty doesn't need a megaphone. It needs a plan. His vision wasn't about beating Trump in a headline war. It was about building a resilient economy immune to tantrums, rooted in long-term thinking and backed by the full faith of a united people. Trump tried to bully Canada into submission. Carney turned the pressure into power. In doing so, he didn't just defend Canada. He defined it